I've been to so many restaurants this year that are really leaning into cultural background.
Mm-hmm.
There was a place in Portland that was Indonesian. And then there were some restaurants around New York that were doing this very special fine dining Mexican, but it was a little bit of Veracruz, but also a little bit of Oaxaca. And it just wasn't directly one kind of cultural scene or one kind of cultural background.
Yeah.
You're less likely to see a menu that is vaguely French, vaguely Italian, or sometimes Japanese. It's going full on Indonesian. It's going full on Thai, but Southern Thai and not Americanized Thai.
Nothing.
I mean, how do you define your cultural background or culture in restaurants?
Well, how I define my cultural background, I feel very fortunate to come from, I'm American, but I have family that came from Italy to this country and then family that came from Mexico. Two super proud and important food cultures. And I feel blessed to have been exposed to that, although I did not grow up there, with the true essence of the culture. But I feel like I got tidbits of it. And then also how in America, we've sort of Americanized some of these things or regionalized growing up in Southern California, because I think it was Enrique Olvera who said, you can get some of the best Mexican food in Los Angeles. There are parts of Mexico, parts of Oaxaca, that these towns have more people in LA now than they do in those specific towns.
There's a neighborhood in Philadelphia that's very similar. Puebla in Mexico, there are more immigrants from Puebla. So in fact, they call it Puebladelphia because most of the people who have migrated into the U.S. or migrated to Philadelphia are from that town. And the ways that they cook and the way they harvest agave has a direct impact on the food scene in Philadelphia. But I want to ask you, because you said we Americanize, so many of these dishes. That's such an interesting concept to me, because there are times that, we have trouble categorizing a lot of foods and putting culture around food and defining it by a culture. Is it Mexican? Is it Mexican-American?
Is it Tex-Mex?
Is it Tex-Mex? Is it Baja?
Yeah.
And so sometimes I'm wondering, is that even the right category when I think about a restaurant like Tatiana in New York or Dakar Nola in New Orleans? These are restaurants that are influenced by West Africa, or influenced by the Caribbean. But I would argue that Tatiana is a very specifically New York restaurant. There are some restaurants that are very LA restaurants or very California or Northern California restaurants because of proximity to ingredients and the ways that those influences from all of the people from those backgrounds start to influence the food. And I don't know if we always talk about the cultural influences of restaurants. And often I found that journalists sometimes lack the vocabulary to be able to discuss cultural influences without feeling appropriative or impolitic. It might have some complexity in defining the language or feeling comfortable with defining language around a lot of different kinds of cultures and people of color who have influenced American cuisine for the last 30 years, I would say.
Well, who've been influencing for hundreds of years, but I think finally getting the recognition, but also a big trend on the podcast that we've been talking about a lot is people embracing who they are.
Yeah.
And by the way, who they are can be a multitude of things.
Exactly.
And embracing that element. And so I think we're in an exciting time right now where the generation who is in maybe it's their 30s, early 40s, maybe even their late 20s, are no longer trying to be something like when we spoke to Daniel Hume about he comes from a French acumen, and that's what you did. That's what you did, where I think other people maybe have gone to traditional schooling and have done that, but have gone back and said, I want to cook my food.
Yeah.
I think the consumer is excited about that, but I'm even more excited that these chefs are able to embrace themselves, I just had John Yao from Cato, and, he said, I was so insecure cooking for other people abroad because when they asked me to define my food, I was insecure about it because he said, I didn't grow up in Taiwan.
Yeah.
I grew up in LA in the San Gabriel Valley. But he said, my food is inspired by Taiwanese food, but it's sort of uniquely SGV, San Gabriel Valley, Los Angeles food.
And I love that centering around a particular region. I love being able to taste things that taste like Michigan, or they taste like Savannah, Georgia. They taste like California. I love a Santa Barbara uni. There's a different flavor that you get that's different from that terroir or flavor profile that you might find in Peru. I was talking to Eric Repair about a month ago, and he has a Puerto Rican pastry chef. And he was telling the chef, hey, I make it more Puerto Rican. You can make it more Puerto Rican, even though he leads one of the most important French restaurants on the planet, known for its consistency, but knowing that the food is being cooked largely by Latin Americans, finally being able to turn into that culture. And I, too, have heard people being insecure about their food. We're also realizing, like people like Gregory Gourdet at Cannes in Portland saying, I should be cooking Haitian food. I need to understand my background, my history and culture by leaning into my heritage. Heritage cooking, I think, is one of the most important trends because I think it's a great way to understand innovation. And I feel very fortunate to live in a time where we are starting to see so many restaurants that are bistros from a concept standpoint, but the food may be Italian, the food may be Indian, it may be Kerala, it might be that specific to a region. And that makes the food system so exciting. And those are the things that I'm always excited to see more of. I want to taste more regions. I want to taste more backgrounds. I want to taste more cultures.
Yeah, and I think what the hope for this specific episode is we challenge and think about why do we deem these foods as important? And how have we talked about these foods? How is the media talking about these foods? How is the consumers talking about these foods? This episode, we have Sean Sherman, Indigenous chef, who is in large part talking about how he's bringing Indigenous foods to the forefront and empowering Indigenous communities, but not just in the US, but really all over the world. And it's really a call to action for anyone who is deeply passionate about their specific food to go out there and do it.
I love what you just said about the call to action. He's giving so many chefs, whether they are indigenous in Brazil or indigenous to Indonesia, giving them permission to celebrate the ingredients and celebrate those backgrounds and cultures that got us here.
I think it's also like reclaim a lot of the lost knowledge and ancestral wisdom that, sadly, as Sean will talk about, was wiped out because of colonization.
Absolutely. And also in this episode, we'll have Rupa Bhattacharya, whose work in media and on the academic side has really helped create a generation of journalists and writers who have to have cultural competency. She's challenged the cultural competency of so many writers that if we're talking about a restaurant like Sean Sherman's restaurant, Owamni, that we are putting it through only an indigenous context and not a French lens or an Italian lens. She was one of the first people who was really fighting for non-italicized words in print or in printed matter. We don't talk enough about how that marginalizes communities. And if we are leaning into culture, we also have to lean into the ways that we talk, write, speak about culture, the way that it appears on our platforms, and the ways that we start to reinforce the message that cuisine is for everybody can start by not italicizing the non-English words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what's fascinating is in that conversation, you'll hear in the span of her career how the narrative and the language in which we discuss cultural foods has changed and has evolved. And I think both Sean and Rupa both said in this episode how there has been a lot of progress.
Absolutely.
And there has been a lot of positive change. But of course, more work to be done.
Of course, more work to be done, but it's been fast because there has been a will. And I think a lot of things, a lot of change doesn't necessarily take a long time when you have the will to say this needs to change. And I love Rupa's story about the way the language is changing and it's also continuing to evolve. And it'll continue to, language changes. Language is always moving. So I feel very encouraged by the way that both of these guests have talked about progress and the ways that it's going to continue.
You're listening to Effects of Change, a Bon Appétit and On the Pass original series about progress, co-hosted by Jamila Robinson, editor-in-chief of Bon Appétit, and myself, Gabriel Ornelas, creator and host of On the Pass.
I opened up my company in 2014, and it had come from quite a few years of researching because I kind of had the epiphany quite a few years before that of just realizing the absence of indigenous food out there in the world and just, basically a strong sense of invisibility against indigenous cultures in general. And there's just so much people don't know about indigenous peoples, even in their own regions. And so it really kind of struck me growing up on a reservation and getting into culinary and getting into restaurant work and then just seeing nothing and knowing very little about my own heritage food. So, for me, it was a personal journey of just trying to understand all of those pieces and what that meant and what my ancestors were eating and how they were harvesting and foraging and how they were, just everything around their whole culinary situation, with a food perspective and just, what were they using for fats and salts and sugars and how are they preserving foods and who are they trading with and all these questions. So for me, it was just this long journey of trying to understand as much as I could about something that had been so thoroughly broken and, all of the assimilation efforts against indigenous peoples and many people in general. Our education is still shaky at best, So when I started the company in 2014, there was just a lot of questions. Well, I was getting a lot of media attention right off the bat, but people didn't understand. So people just kept asking. They would just be like, oh, weird Native American food. What is that? Never heard of it, and I would just have to explain, what the purpose was and what our philosophy was and, why we were cutting away things like wheat flour and cane sugar and dairy products and beef and pork and chicken and just really focused on what are foods and flavors of North America, particularly, especially through an indigenous perspective. And, it took a while for the media to start to change, but we started seeing a lot more Native chefs coming out right away. We started seeing a lot more effort into this indigenous food sovereignty movement. And we just, been kind of at it from the start. And we've just seen so much happen over such a short period of time. I feel like it's been a long journey, but also I realize that it hasn't been that long. We've gotten a lot accomplished in a very short time period. And, I think it's a bright future for people to understand the terms decolonization, for people to understand what it means to decolonize their diet, why this indigenous food movement is growing and popular and what it means. With the work we're doing, it's more than just trying to showcase some kind of new fad or something that hadn't been touched before. It's really just bringing back a lot of really important knowledge because indigenous peoples, we see it. I look at it through a pan-indigenous level and just look at indigenous peoples from around the globe and the connection that they had to the land spaces that they lived in and the cultures that were developed around that. And, so it doesn't matter where you're from, like there's been indigenous people and knowledge holders everywhere, whether you're in the Americas, North or South, or Africa, India, Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand, Hawaii. And there's just so much that has happened against indigenous peoples on a global scale. And taking a snapshot of that here in the U.S. and looking at U.S. history and understanding what does the term colonization mean or what does it mean to decolonize. So I do a lot of speaking engagements and I always start with that exact piece because I'll just tell people to understand what it means to decolonize your diet or what does it mean to, just that and just what is colonization in general, So I just define that. And colonization is the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying it with settlers, exploiting it economically. And you can distill that down to basically just, land grabbing for the sake of extraction for profit, right? People take over land spaces, they pull what they think is going to make them lots of money, and that's basically the gist of colonization. Food is a really powerful language, and food is something that really binds us together. Food is something that we all have in common as humans across the globe, and it's also a really great way for people to start to understand other people's cultures. It's really an important thing, and for a lot of people in America, because of the history of America, it's really hard for us sometimes in some of our cultures because our cultures had been so assimilated. And all this push to celebrate the history of colonialism instead of naming it for how violent it was and how extremely damaging it's been. So when we go from a decolonized stance and perspective, then we're able to start to see how we're able to peel back some of that, and that we're able to reclaim some of our cultures, some of our heritage, some of our ancestral ways, and appreciate that diversity that we have as Indigenous peoples on a global scale and start to protect those, and that's what it really means, is that it's a movement of reclamation. It's a movement of protecting these cultures for future generations and stewarding them. And we might not even see these massive changes happen in our own lifetime, but it's really important to know that the best we can do is plant some seeds to start that direction. So our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren will have more doors open for them as they work through this life, and we just need to work to be better humans in general. So our philosophy that we started right off the bat was just removing colonized ingredients from our land spaces, so we took away wheat flour, cane sugar, dairy products, beef, pork, and chicken. All those products were introduced, like dairy was around, but it was for child rearing. So most people stopped utilizing dairy by the time, at the age of 11 at the oldest, really. And we start to lose all of the enzymes to break down that lactose anyways around that time period. Most people around the world have that situation. So it's just really important to take a look at, where are you living and what was the true food of that land space? Or, if some of us have been moved around and how did our ancestors survive? How did they get through a lot of the violence and the trauma and the abuse over these past centuries? And, how can we start to take steps to reclaim, what was once theirs, and the knowledge bases that should have been passed down through them. So it's important to look at education and curriculum through a Eurocentric perspective and just realize that there's other viewpoints of indigeneity and education out there that's so important for us to understand on a global scale. And we really need to start building an education system outside of that Eurocentric viewpoint, And that's a big part of the work that we chose to do here in Minneapolis and Minnesota with the startup of our own nonprofit with two main focuses of just looking at trying to create access to Indigenous education, trying to create access to Indigenous foods. And those are the two pillars we're building on because those are two of the main fronts that the U.S. government had against us as Indigenous peoples, is taking us away from our food, taking us away from our education and our culture. So it's important to identify Indigenous education because that's countless generations of really important knowledge, giving us the tools to have a relationship with the world around us so we could eat, so we can have food, so we can have medicine, so we can have shelter and tools and everything. The world around us provides so much. And our Indigenous ancestors worked really hard as communities to provide enough food for, our entire communities, and any surplus was utilized to trade with other groups around them. So we need to work better for our food systems. We need to think smarter about our land spaces. We need to stop thinking in that colonial perspective of just trying to make a buck off of everything, because we see a lot of people get excited about wild foods, I can make so much money by selling some of these mushrooms from the forest or something like that, and we need to break free from that. We need to remove money from our food when it comes down to it in the future, because our ancestors never had monetary value with their food systems from an Indigenous perspective. We just worked really hard to make sure everybody had enough food to eat. And just been doing everything we can just to be positive role models in this work, So I get a lot of attention and, there's this kind of persona of, celebrity chef stuff, but that has nothing to do with the work because the work isn't about me personally, I just utilize all of that to keep moving forward because it does help to open up more doors as we kind of keep growing. But really, we just really want to be role models, because at the restaurant in Minneapolis at Awamni, we have about 150 employees when it's busy during the summer season. And, 70% of our staff identifies as Indigenous, and we're just giving a lot of opportunity to do something completely different, completely intentional, And because of our, decolonized perspective, like, the restaurant's gluten-free, dairy-free, sugar-free, soy-free, pork-free, all these things. So it's really healthy too. And we're just really trying to do everything we can to tell a story through food, to share these stories, and to allow people to literally come in and consume them. And it's just a wonderful space that we just really want to continue to curate and grow. And, with the work of the nonprofit, we just really want to help other people do the same thing and try to eliminate a lot of hurdles, because it's hard for a lot of people of color in the United States because we don't typically have a lot of generational wealth to help us, finance $500,000 to open up a restaurant somewhere, because those kinds of things are just out of reach, for a lot of us. And we just really want to figure out ways and strategies to see more people of color in general have better access to creating businesses, to sharing story through food, to feeding communities, and to finding their passion, through food. And just, there's so much to celebrate when it comes to the food ways of things, but there's a lot of work that we have to do because we live in a country that has a really dark history that has, is really built on a structure of white supremacy. And it's just a really tough situation for us, because as Indigenous peoples or anybody of color, but as for Indigenous peoples growing, within the history of the United States, like the biggest value that we had was the land spaces that we stood on, which made it very dangerous because, the United States government realized by removing us, they could capture those land spaces, and colonize it in a sense. Well, not in a sense, but literally colonize it and make an immense amount of money by, portioning it out and selling it off. That's a big portion of how the United States government makes a ton of money, and as for Indigenous Africans that were being stolen and brought over to North America and the US, like, the biggest value for them that was put on them was the value of their bodies. And, the United States government has not yet come close to coming to terms with how it becomes this global power, utilizing stolen Indigenous land spaces and utilizing stolen Indigenous peoples from Africa, especially, to help build all of this and being forced to. And we just have a lot of reparations to go through. We have a lot of rethinking, and it's such a crazy time in history because now we're seeing entire states turn around and say that things like African American history is not valuable enough for students to learn, and entire history books are being rewritten for this purpose of this re-whitewashing of American history and this newly found celebration of uplifting colonial history and removing the violence, removing the truths, and removing like all these important things that we should be learning from. So it's really important for us who can hold stages and have some knowledge of these histories to share these histories and to talk about it, because it affects all of us. And it definitely affects the food systems that we're in because of the structures that were set up, because 98% of all privately owned land in the U.S. is still owned by white Eurocentric, owners. And we have a lot to go through, and so much of everything has been built against us. So we need to really come together as all people of color to really stand up and to really showcase the value that we have, which is so much, Or we have artists, we have chefs, we have farmers and growers, and we have so much to offer the world, and so much reclamation can be brought because we can live in two worlds. We can live in the past with our ancestors, and we can live in the now to show how we can be something completely different. The restaurant is really just a proof of concept that we can have a fully decolonized restaurant concept in today's world that really goes against the grain, because right now, if you drive across North America and stop at restaurants, you can basically write the menu before you step inside. You're going to have some kind of popular trendy burger, you're going to have a Caesar salad, you're going to have like all these things that are just typical and basically greatest hits on every menu across the board. But with Indigenous focused, menus like we have at Awamni, we just look forward to the day that you can drive across, find some of these Indigenous focused restaurants and see such amazing regional and cultural diversity across the board and start to experience how much amazing diversity we have in North America. And there's, obviously a lot of work to do, and I can't say I'll see this in my lifetime, but at least we're starting the efforts to make these things happen for the future. So I tried my best to make this whole business model sustainable. So the restaurant purchases a lot of nixtamalized corn and fresh made tortillas and masa from the Indigenous Food Lab. So that way the restaurant's always pushing money into the nonprofit, making it a lot more sustainable for our staff to be working a lot of these projects. And as we grow, we're just going to continue to find ways to be a much more sustainable nonprofit by just helping to get food out there and, just working on ways so we're not just completely, reliant on grants and things like that, but we're actually creating a system to be self-sustainable for the future, because that's where it's going to be. But these models are really important, and we think tribal communities can be really good role models of what can happen. So if we can just get one indigenous tribal community to really think about having more community gardens and helping them with seeds and education around that, having more permacultural design, and just, helping to landscape our spaces with the purpose of food, and just putting food basically everywhere, and creating commercial kitchen spaces to help process all of these foods in a really safe way, of course, because food safety is really important, and just create a ton of pantry items for people, for communities, and just become a lot more self-reliant. Because I always say that, if we can control our food, we can control our destiny. And it's really important that we work towards that, because that's how all of our ancestors had been surviving for countless generations, by working together as a community with their foods in mind to make sure that they had enough to get through each year. And we should not be reliant on outside forces, especially governments when it comes down to it, or allowing politicians to decide how much food and what kind of nutritional access we should have, because that just doesn't work. Because growing up on Pine Ridge, we had one grocery store to service an area the size of Connecticut, and we had very little food access, and not much has changed today, because now there's just a couple of fast food places on the res. And we still have basically that same food access issue, which either you're getting food from the commodity food program, or you're getting food from gas stations or fast foods. And there's a direct connection as to why some of these tribal communities, like where I grew up, can have upwards to 60% type 2 diabetes, an immense amount of obesity, and all these things that come around because of that, like heart disease and all the other ailments that happen because of this. And it all comes down to nutritional food access. But it also comes down to just the racial structure of the United States, and how a lot of these indigenous communities are still very segregated communities when it comes down to it. There's still so much inequality that happens still today, whether it's nutrition or finance or economics or whatever it might be, but we have a lot of work to do. I just think that, people need to be brave to try something different. We need a lot more intention in our food systems, because there's just so much garbage that's put out there across the board, because I travel a lot, and it's so hard to find anything healthy, anything interesting. And, there are a lot of great restaurants, don't get me wrong. We visit a lot of them. There's some amazing chefs out there. And, and we're always, especially on the hunt for just BIPOC-owned businesses, which is hard to find a lot of the times when you're traveling around. And we just need to get people to think about, like, where are the foods coming from that they're purchasing, that they're selling to their community, and like, why are you making that choice? Because there's so much just over-processed junk food that just goes into our food systems. There's so little scratch-made food out there, and we just need to really go back to just whole foods, and we should just be enjoying things. And it's not hard to make plant-based foods. You don't have to have fake burgers just to have, a vegan option. Like, you can just let vegetables be vegetables. They're so good, and you don't have to do much to them. And we just need to eat healthier. We need to think about the health of our customers, so we don't need, 3,000 calorie hamburgers and promoting that constantly. Like, that's all we see when we go out there, is just like these monstrosities of culinary things, with just like burgers with bacon and bourbon, beer stuff all over it, and there's just like 1 trillion calories, and it doesn't do anybody any good. And sure, it tastes good for a half a moment, but then you just don't feel good after you eat this food. You never do. And we should be listening to our bodies, and we're taught not to. We're taught to ignore them. We're taught to, the culture is taught to basically just eat until you feel almost sick. And then that's how food is supposed to work. And it's not. Like, we just need a little bit of good food, and that little bit goes a long ways, So if you eat at Omni, like, everything's really clean, and you feel that, like, you can eat a lot and feel full, but you don't feel gross when you leave. Like, it's just clean burning. And we should just, there should be more options like that out there. We should be able to find just a lot more clean foods out there. And chefs are in a great position to be super creative. Like, we don't have to just have the same things over and over. Like, we should be willing to try things. And there's so many cultures around the world. And that's why I just really want to see what people come up with when they start to push away that Eurocentric viewpoint and start to really dig deep into their cultures and see what they come up with. Because, we don't have to recreate the past. We can create the future right now. And obviously, we need a lot more storytellers out there. We need a lot more spotlight, especially on projects like what I'm doing. And there's many other native chefs out there coming out, working really hard and going through a lot of the same struggles of just trying to raise enough capital to start something that they really believe in. And, and we just need to really support, so much, and again, like, no matter which city or community we're living in, we should just be looking out to some of these projects and all these other communities, because one other project I've been working on is with my partner, Mecca Boss, who's a food writer, and she's really focused on Black foodways of Minnesota in her past, and she's been a chef for a long time. But as we got together, we just started, realizing how we were also kind of siloing our own cultures, from everybody else. So we created an organization called BIPOC Foodways Alliance to really start to bring more stories to the table, literally, and bring people of color together to really celebrate our diversities and really talk about these things because we have so much in common. And it's really fun to create these dinner parties where we just bring in a select few of people to share somebody's food history and food stories from their families. And Mecca really likes to celebrate, especially the women in the families because they're typically the ones that hand down a lot of the food stories and a lot of the recipes. And a lot of these recipes aren't written or people like this don't get a lot of the attention, but they should, because somewhere in somebody's family history, there's women who have carried so much of food knowledge, through history for us. And we should be celebrating that. So as we travel around the nation, again, like we're always looking for any kind of BIPOC focused foodways of people to see what they're coming up with, because we're all kind of in the same boat. We're all working together for the same purpose. And we know we just need to shine more spotlights on that. And then we need to just, to allow people of color to really be the ones to showcase to the world what their foodways are, and not have it come from a Eurocentric viewpoint, which we've seen so often of people, you'll see a white chef discovering Oaxaca cuisine and making tons of money and tons of restaurants off of it, and they're just putting them in white neighborhoods and making it safe for white people. And we need to go beyond that. We need to celebrate the source of these foods, the source of these cultures, and allow the voices that come from those cultures to be the ones to really explain and share and show the love that their cultures have to offer. As much as I enjoy all the work and all the attention, I do want to slow down a little bit because I do want to enjoy life. I do want to enjoy having dinners with my family and being at home sometimes. I feel like I'm just constantly on the road lately, which I enjoy this opportunity immensely. And don't get me wrong, I don't take for granted the opportunity I have to hold the stage and to share the stories that I choose to share and to talk about the histories that that people don't like to talk about, and be able to do that. But I really want to, see more and more people to be able to take these spaces and to do this alongside me. And just, again, I want to set up that next generation. So I'm hoping that I don't work myself too hard to get all this done, even though I see it as a really beautiful opportunity.
And now let's hear from Rupa Bhattacharya.
There have been a lot of small changes with long-ranging impact that I've been able to be part of over the course of my career. So when I was 23 years old, I made the Food Network stop saying Oriental. And that's one of those things that I'm not actually that old that this should have happened at all or really ever. But it's fascinating because we had to go through the website and change all the salads and all the grocery store references and all the ways to go shopping to away from Oriental. And, advice too, there were things that we did that were we published an essay that was one of the first on the subject about not calling food crack anymore, not comparing food to crack. And while there are plenty of chefs who will not attribute the changing the names of their products away from crack to that story or the wave of discourse that unleashed, but there are some significant shifts in the way that food is being discussed that have happened over the course of my career that I got to be part of and have a hand in. I'm based out of New York, but my whole team is in Napa. And so I travel up there quite a bit. And when I do that, I land in SFO and I drive up through the Mission and I get a burrito because I'm human. I'm not a monster. And I do it every time. And I was stopped at a spot I hadn't been to in a minute, a Taqueria Cancun. And on their wall is a Zagat rating from 2000 and I believe 4, right around the time that I entered the industry, and another from relatively recently. And the change that you can see, and of course it's user generated, so some of this is about how users talk about food, but some, of course it's also curated, right? So the curatorial decisions made about how we talk about food, the difference is night and day between the 2004 or whatever it was reviews, the GAT rating of this taqueria, and the 2022 one. It really is. It's a completely different landscape. It's a completely different universe. And the one from 2004 is genuinely horrifying. I mean, there's like every cliche banned word you can possibly imagine. And like, it's like intrepid foodies, make their way through dicey neighborhoods for these south of the best large, like, generous serving, the most generous servings north of the border. Like, just genuinely horrifying. Like, you're just like, yo, like what? Who made those decisions? That was actually what the discourse was like, right? Like, people did talk that way about other cultures and it was like gringos. It was like, intrepid gringos, brave, dicey neighborhoods or something like that. Those are horrifying. And, knowing that could never happen today, or that no longer happens in these spaces, is amazing. And it's something that I think that, the places, the work that I've done has had a large hand in changing. And I think that's massive. I think that's, that's something I'm really proud of. I'm also really proud that it happened behind the scenes. Like, I haven't been somebody who's like at the forefront saying, hey, look at me, because that's not my job. I don't see that. Like, so much of my work is around building the structures so that people can then exist, right? And so I don't feel the need to be at the forefront of, or the visible face of change, because I don't think that's helpful. I have a lot of thoughts about this, the way that sort of media was and the way that gatekeeping works and all of these things. I've always felt that my job as somebody who, can get into these spaces, who I come with receipts, I have credentials, I have all these things. My job is to kick the door down for everybody else, right? Like, my job is to, look at, every job that I get at, at Vice, et cetera, I'd have like over 1,000 applicants for it. I'd look at every single one of them, and the people I hired were exceptional. And some of them didn't have food background. Some of them didn't have, the writing background. Some of them hadn't been in publications before, but they were talented and wonderful. And like, that's something that I think is a really critical responsibility in this field of, sort of that's like being an editor. Fundamentally, you're being an editor of society. And I think that's the trajectory that, like, where this feels appropriate, where it feels curatorial and editorial, essentially, where what I'm doing now is a lot of work around public health and nutrition, the way that the food establishment works with public health. I run the Strategic Initiatives Group over at the CIA, which is this internal sort of in-house think tank that works with the restaurants and food service industry to push forward sustainable, helps restaurants and food service folks do make sustainable, delicious food that's better for people on the planet, and also explore sort of bigger ideas in the world of food. But a lot of that work too is about how do we shape the approach to sustainable eating, healthy eating, et cetera, so that it feels appropriate, so that it feels relevant. The folks are themselves intrinsically motivated, not because we set up some sort of like Rube Goldberg situation, so you have to get through like a maze of kale to get to the chocolate or whatever, right? It's not that. It's you have to have people desire. Like, you have to figure out why people might want a thing and figure out how to communicate why they might want that thing and have them want that thing, as opposed to the sort of top-down, very prescriptive approach, which has historically been more of the case, right? So Worlds of Flavor is the flagship conference for the Strategic Initiatives Group, the think tank that the CIA runs. Last year was a sort of a really big watershed one, and it was about the food of the African diaspora, launched in conjunction with the CIA's African Studies. And one of the things that I thought was really important with Worlds of Flavor is to actually shift Worlds of Flavor a little bit, to be less about a specific place and more about big ideas in food. Because one of the things that I loved in media, right, was being able to change the discourse. With Worlds of Flavor, one of the things that I really love and what my goal is to change the window in which the discourse operates, right? And so with Worlds of Flavor, the African diaspora, one of the things we were talking about was about labor and not just labor in terms of like the workforce and in terms of like your line cooks, et cetera, but labor in terms of like who owns things, who brought things where, who gets credit, who gets paid, how does this stuff work? How can you make sure that when we talk about these cuisines, these cultures, these people, and so much of this stuff that was brought about as a result of involuntary displacement, right? How do you make sure that you tell these stories in ways that are respectful, honest, and true? Moving into this idea of big ideas, this year's conference is about authenticity. And that's something that I feel very strongly about, because that word has often been used as like a sledgehammer, right? It's frequently used as a sledgehammer. It's used as a sledgehammer against very specific populations. I feel personally about this. I mean, I'm Bengali. I was born in the Midwest. I moved to New York when I was 6. I grew up in a mostly Jewish community, and I moved to Germany at 16, and I trained French. And frankly, the Bengali home cooking I grew up with was taken away from my family by the same public health establishment that I now work to make sure that doesn't happen to other people. For my mother was told that her Bengali diet of fish, rice, and vegetables was bad for her cholesterol and that she should move to a Mediterranean model. but they told her that basically that meant she had to eat, Mediterranean food. And they just sort of told her that her food wasn't okay, and so she stopped cooking. So I have no relationship to Bengali home cooking. One of the things that I feel really strongly about authenticity is that there are certain people who are allowed to have the full scope of human experience, especially in food, right? There are plenty of people, and if you looked at my food, right, again, Bengali American, mom stopped cooking when I was like 12, moved to Germany where they don't season anything, and then, trained French, right? Like, what is that? What is my food, right? Was my food authentic? Yeah, it's authentic to my experience, right? But like, what am I allowed to have that experience? And, and I spent 11 years at Food Network where like, I speak a bunch of languages, and I absolutely was called into a meeting recently, like at one point as somebody who spoke fluent Indian. So, like there's all these expectations of like who I was supposed to be, right? It was wild. The things that would happen are wild, and I probably shouldn't tell them on this particular podcast. But again, like the expectation is I'm brown, my last name's hard to spell, therefore I must be an expert on authentic Indian food. So in any case, authenticity to me is also a question of like, who do we allow to have the full scope of humanity? So I think that one of the like root drivers of my work has always been about meeting people where they are in a lot of ways. A lot of my work has historically been a form of service journalism. People come to Food Network to learn to write recipes, or learn to cook rather. People come to Vice to learn how to be cool. A lot of what I did, even when I left food for a bit and was doing culture at Vice, a lot of that work was still around helping people do the thing they want to do, right? They want to know whatever they need to know about, SoundCloud rap or whatever. So let me tell you how to do that. But in order to know those things, in order to be a good service journalist, you have to have a certain amount of understanding of the humanity of your audience and empathy for what they actually require, right? Like understanding your audience and knowing who you're talking to has been a hallmark of my career this whole time. One of the things that I'm trying to do right now with the think tank and the public health work is like make sure that we know that we're talking about people, right? We're talking about people. We're talking about their food. We're talking about their tables, their families, their habits. And you simply cannot superimpose someone else's best practices onto somebody and say, hey, good luck with that, right? That's not how anything works. How do we then, if we do want to have people eat more plants, if we do want to have people eat less animal products, if we do want to have people eat in a more sustainable way, then what is the answer? The answer has always, to me, been about finding the intrinsic motivation, and you can't figure out what people want unless you have a fully formed respect for their humanity and an ability to sort of understand who they are and what might drive them, right? And so one of the ways that I describe the work that we do is in a lot of ways about bringing empathy, or sort of bringing an undercurrent of empathy to these sort of like frequently very prescriptive, very dry ideas, and figuring out the best way to put them in place with the deep and like visceral understanding that people are human. And I think what I really want for people is I want people to feel seen, and like irrelevant who they are. We have a conference that's entirely for doctors to learn to cook so they can teach their patients to cook. I want them to feel seen. I want them to feel seen no matter who their audience is, right? And I think the way that we do that is we build these things that that don't presume a universal, that don't presume a default. And one of the reasons I want to talk about authenticity at Worlds of Flavor is to really blow up the idea that there is a one true good, right? There are certain things that have been codified, and those codifications exist. But again, even through codification, that was still a decision, right? That was still curated. The mother sausage didn't spring fully formed out of Zeus's head, right? Like that's not a thing. Like somebody had to do it. And so then what, right? That was a decision, that was a choice that reflected that person at that time's humanity and their projection of what society might require. And so nothing is more or less valid than anything else, right? Like, and in order for it to be meaningful, we have to really genuinely think about who we're talking to and how we're talking to them. One of the things that I think is really important is, and this is something that I think about a lot, is not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think in a lot of ways we think about, and so much of this best practices driven, top-down, sort of instructive work has come from this idea that we need to hit the perfect. Everybody needs to be vegan, or everybody needs to be X, Y, or Z. And the answer is actually no. If you can make small incremental change that then stacks upon each other, you're looking at the equivalent of compound interest, right? And like, that's really how we have to see things, because otherwise it's simply alienating. I had worked with one really wonderful chef RDs recently, who was one of whom is Cuban, and was talking about how she doesn't prescribe brown rice in her community because if she did, no one would listen to anything she said. And so there's things where she chooses her battles, right? She chooses her battles because she's like, well, if I can get you to add some greens to your rice and beans, then I'm winning, right? Or whatever it is, right? And so it's things like that that I think are really critical, like understanding. And again, this goes back to the fundamental notion that people are human and you have to meet them somewhere. And with the CIA's programming, something that I'm doing really intentionally is really working to bring sort of the notions of empathy and humanity to the forefront. And what that means is multifold. The first is making sure that our presenters represent the audience of, the diners, eaters, the sort of people that we're trying to reach. So some of that is about making sure that we have sort of a broad swath of presenters who represent America in the ways that I want them to. The other is really looking carefully at the way we talk to people, about people, and the kind of suggestions we put forth for how operators should exist in order to best serve their audiences. And a lot of that, again, is understanding who they're speaking to, understanding who they're trying to serve, and reverse engineering what they do to get there, if that makes sense. I think historically there has always been this idea that there is this best practice. There's a best practice of a creme brulee. There's a best practice of a diet. And if you just hit that, then you're golden, right? If you hit like exactly this platonic ideal that was determined somewhere of a diet or a dish, then your work is done. And that's not actually true anymore, if it ever was, right? Like their audience that was presupposed by this notion of best practices may never actually have been real. But in any case, we know demographically that it's not real anymore either. And so a lot of what I want people to do is move away from this notion of a universal best and move towards the notion of tailoring what they do to the people that they're serving. And so a lot of that is about, I want to teach operators to see people, and I want to teach restaurateurs to see people in the ways that they need to be seen. One of the things I realized after a very long career in media was that in order to really affect massive structural change, you need to get in on the ground floor, and you need to get in with the future leaders. You need to get at the people who are going to be running kitchens someday, running kitchens, running media properties, running pretty much all the things that we think are going to have impact in the food world. And you need to introduce that notion of sort of humanity and empathy, which is not to say that it wasn't being done before, of course, right? Food is fundamentally one of the most human things that we have. And if we can teach this generation of future leaders to work the notions of empathy and humanity into their food practices, no matter what they are, then we're already so much further down the line. I think that's how you create real, groundswells of change. Everyone says that food brings people together. It's something you hear a lot, right? You always hear food brings people together. But another thing it also really does is separate people, right? How does what you eat define who you are? And how does who you are define what you eat, right? Those questions were really the through line of our content approach at Munchies. And I think about that a lot, right? Because so much of food, whether it's religious restrictions or dietary restrictions or desires or the way things are coded in terms of gender and local origin, et cetera, there are so many ways that food can divide us, right? And there are so many ways that food is so inherent, an expression of somebody's fundamental personhood, that one of the things that I think is just so unbelievably critical is acknowledging that, right? I mean, it sounds so simple, but it's true. I'm a New Yorker. If you told me I could never have a slice again, I feel like I would be really sad. I don't know. It's not even, I don't know how much pizza I even eat. I eat pizza once a month, but I would be really sad. This is part of the culture. And I would be really sad if you told me, okay, no more, you can only have salads, right? It's a cliche to say that it's a connector, but I think it's worth acknowledging that severing people from this connection is really scary and really damaging. And we need to be really careful with what we think about, with the way we approach people's relationship to their own food. And that's just something that's been on my mind a little bit as I think about sort of us and public health and what the sort of work we're doing. How do we make sure that we're doing this in a culturally sensitive and meaningful and appropriate way?
On the next episode of Effects of Change,
I felt I had the responsibility to now use this platform to speak. We need to speak. Chefs need to speak.
It's not a classic job in terms of hours. It's not 9 to 6. We work until very late. That's been the most difficult challenge, to balance my motherhood and take care of what I love and what I do.
And even though during that time our business was facing bankruptcy, all of a sudden I got up in the morning and feeling happy.
There's not many women leading international restaurants. And in that sense, this award, I think it's important since it's a way to encourage more women to do so.
Effects of Change is produced by myself, Gabriel Ornelas, edited, mixed, and mastered by Dylan Agajanian, with original music by Dylan Agajanian.